In the last module, we focused for the markets for all kinds of different factors of demand, land, labor, and capital. And in Module 71, we're going to focus on the market for labor because labor receives almost 70% of the distribution of income of all the different factors. But for this module, we're going to stop and pause and look at how the market for land and capital actually works, two of the other factors of production. So in this module, we will determine supply and demand in the markets for land and capital, two of the three factors of production. We will find the equilibrium in the land and capital markets, and I will explain how the demand for factors leads to the marginal productivity theory of income distribution that helps to explain why income is distributed in the way that it is based on the pie chart on distribution of income we looked at in the previous module. So, Module 69 demonstrated that the demand for the labor input is derived from the demand for goods being produced by the labor. Graphically, the downward sloping value of the marginal product curve is the firm's demand for labor. So if we maintain the assumption that the markets for goods and services are perfectly competitive, the result that was derived for the labor market also applies to other factors of production such as land and capital. So to maximize profit, a landowner will rent or demand more land up until the value of the marginal product of an acre of land, and that is equal to the rental rate per acre. Or an owner of capital will rent more capital until the value of the marginal product of that capital good is equal to the rental rate for that unit of capital. So the decision of whether to rent or demand an additional piece of capital comes down to a comparison of the additional cost of that land or equipment and the value that is received from the additional output that is produced by that land or capital. Now, when we look at the supply of land is relatively steep. Why? Because land is limited. Right? It has a very inelastic supply curve because you can't easily just produce more land. When we use land up for buildings or farming or things like that, it is no longer available for other uses and we can't produce more of it. It's fixed, so it's relatively elastic. So it's often difficult and expensive to find new land. If we want new land for farming, we have to pay a high cost to provide irrigation and it becomes difficult. What we are going to see is that the supply curve for capital is more elastic and more responsive to price. Why is that? Well, because when new capital is needed, if the price of it goes up, people that provide money for capital, investors in capital, are much more willing to do so much more quickly and easily. So the supply curve for land relatively inelastic, the supply curve for capital relatively elastic. So when studying competitive factor markets, remember that all inputs are paid the equilibrium marginal revenue product in that particular market. So think about demand in the markets for land and capital. Okay? The next unit of land or capital employed also has a value of marginal product attached to it. And diminishing returns to production ensure that the value of the marginal product for each is downward sloping. So how does the owner of the firm determine how much land and capital to employ? In the same way the firm hires labor. If the return on the next unit of land or capital is greater than or equal to the marginal cost of employing that unit of capital, then that unit is employed. If the marginal cost of employing that unit of land or capital is greater than the marginal revenue product of what it receives, then it will not be employed. So economists use the term rental rate to refer to the marginal cost or price of hiring the next unit of land or capital. Remember, when we were hiring the next unit of labor, the price was called the wage. Well, if we're talking about hiring the next unit of land or capital, the price is referred to as the rental rate. And so that's something you need to know. So to maximize profit from the hiring of land, we are going to employ units of land up to the point where the value of the marginal product of that land is equal to the rental rate for that land. Likewise, to maximize profit from the hiring of capital, we are going to employ units of capital up to the point where the value of the marginal product of capital is equal to the rental rate for that capital. So what exactly is this rental rate? Well, we can think about the rental rate in two ways, either as an explicit cost, with money we actually pay to rent the land or capital, or as an implicit cost, meaning we already own the land or capital, but we could rent it out to someone else for an additional use, and we're giving up that money by using it ourselves. So remember, an explicit cost is when the firm is renting the use of a machine, a building, or a parcel of land from another person who owns the capital or land. So this might represent a monthly rental payment to that person in the explicit cost of the firm. But what if we already own the land or capital ourselves? Well, then there is an implicit cost of using it ourselves. We already own the machine, we already own the building or parcel of land, but there are other people out there who might like to rent it from us for themselves in their own use. If we use the capital or land for ourselves, we give up the rental income that we could receive from someone else using it. So that is an implicit or opportunity cost for the firm. Either way, whether it's an explicit or implicit cost, it is a cost to the firm for using that land or capital. And so either way, it's called the rental rate for that land or capital. Now, let's talk about supply in the markets for land and capital. As I said, the supply of land is upward sloping, like what we see here in this graph, but nearly vertical or very inelastic. After all, there are only so many square miles or kilometers of usable land in the nation. If the rental rate of farmland were to increase, it is possible to convert land from non-farm use to farm use, but it's very costly to do so. The supply of capital is upward sloping, but much less steep or very elastic. If the rental rate on capital rises, firms if the rental rate on capital rises, firms that supply capital will simply operate their factories longer and create more capital machines. Now, if you are taking macroeconomics, you might be learning that the funds for new investment in capital machinery and new construction come from savers. So if the rate of return on savings rises, households will save more money, thus greasing the wheels of new investment spending. Now, this figure illustrates both the markets for land and capital. I've drawn here only the market for farmland in this graph that you see in front of you. Equilibrium in this market for farmland is where the original supply curve, S1, intersects the demand curve. Now, let's suppose over the course of many years, farmland is converted to housing developments, golf courses, and Chuck E. Cheese's. The supply curve shifts to the left, decreasing the equilibrium quantity of land and increasing the price or rental rate of each acre of farmland. Here we see the two side by side. In panel A, we see the market for land with its relatively steep and inelastic supply curve because it's very difficult to supply more land and at great cost. In panel B, we see the market for capital, which has a much more elastic supply curve because it's much easier to supply more capital and get more people to invest their savings in providing for capital when capital rates go up. Now here's a tip for the AP exam. The factor market graph is a supply and demand graph with different labels. So for the AP exam, you should be able to draw, label, and analyze changes just as you do for other supply and demand graphs that we have learned about earlier in the course. Now, here we look at demand, the rental rate, and what we call economic rent. Okay? economic rent is similar to what we might think of as economic profit. Okay, and so if we think of land, as being relatively inelastic, let's assume that we're talking about land in Ouray, Colorado, where you have a flat piece of land in a valley surrounded by mountains. So the amount of land that's available there for potential farming is absolutely fixed, and it would have a perfectly inelastic supply curve like the one represented here. Well, if we had a demand for that land that was demand curve 1, as you can see, it doesn't intersect the supply curve anywhere, so the rental rate for that land would be equal to 0, and that fixed amount of land would be provided for free. But if we shift to demand curve 2, you can see that the rental rate would be $1,000 per acre. Okay, and so the total amount of economic rent that would be earned by the owners of this land would be $1,000 times the 512 acres that are earned, or the area of that rectangle. But if the demand for that land were to increase and shift rightward up to D3, you can see that the rental rate per acre for that land would increase to $4,000 an acre. It wouldn't increase the amount of land available, it would just increase the price of the land, but it would increase the economic rent provided to the owners of that land. It would now be $4,000 per acre multiplied by the 512 acres of land that is there, and so it would be the entire area of the green area. So economic rent can be earned sometimes when you are receiving more money for the price of the land or capital you are providing than what you would be willing to provide it for. You might be willing to provide it for less, but if the price goes up, then you can actually earn economic rent. So economic rent is similar to producer surplus. Think of it that way, okay? Except that economic rent applies in factor markets and producer surplus applies in the markets for goods and services, the product market. But you can think of it the same way. It's like, with producer surplus, they are able to produce something maybe at a lower cost than the price they charge it for, so they get surplus by supplying it at a price that is higher than their cost of producing it. Well, economic rent works the same way. These landowners may be willing to supply the land for less money than they receive for the land, but because the demand curve shifts and the price goes higher, they actually get a bonus from that higher price and receive a price higher than they're willing to provide it for. And so it's like surplus to them. But we refer to it in the factor market as economic rent. Now, we have learned that when the markets for goods and services and the factor markets are perfectly competitive, factors of production will be employed up to the point at which the value of the marginal product is equal to their price. If all factor markets are in equilibrium, the last unit employed is paid a wage or rental rate equal to the value of the marginal product, and this is called marginal productivity theory. And it helps to explain the distribution of income that we saw in the last module. Because labor's share of factor income is about 70%, it must be the case that labor's value of the marginal product is greater than other factors for land and capital. So what marginal productivity theory says is that the wage that is paid to a worker in a specific market the wage that's paid to all workers, I should say, in that market, is going to be equal to the marginal revenue product of the last worker hired, or the last unit of land hired, or the last unit of capital hired. And so that will be the wage paid to all of the workers, or the rental rate for the land. It's what we call the equilibrium wage or the equilibrium land thing. And so that helps to determine rental rates and wages paid for land and how much of total income is received by land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurs. And so this theory, marginal productivity theory, is an important theory that helps to explain this distribution of income and how it's divided up amongst the different factors of production. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it in this particular video, but in your reading, in your book for Module 70, in the last part of Module 70, it does go into more detail on explaining marginal productivity theory. And so you should spend a little bit of time reading it in that module and understanding it and how it works. What I will say is that the marginal productivity theory of income distribution says that each factor is paid the value of the output generated by the last unit of that factor employed in the factor market as a whole. So if we want to look at the wage rate that is paid to bakers, for example, well, we would say, well, what is the marginal revenue product that is produced by the last baker hired? And whatever the value of that marginal revenue product is, that will determine the equilibrium paid wage that is paid to all workers in that market. And then that is helping to determine how income is distributed in that market and in the labor market as a whole. So doesn't the marginal productivity theory income distribution imply that, let's say, machinists should be paid the revenue they generate? Let's say they generate $130,000 of revenue, but they're only paid $70,000 a year in their wage. Well, this isn't necessarily true. The theory says that they will be paid the value of the marginal product of the last machinist hired. And due to diminishing returns of labor, that value will be lower than the overall average provided by previous workers. So a worker's equilibrium wage rate also includes other benefits. Remember, it's not just the wage you're paid, but you have value to job security, training that the firm provides for you, new hires, benefits such as health insurance and vacation time. So in the end, it does appear that the marginal product theory of income distribution does hold. Here is an activity that we will do in class on fixed factors of production, like fixed amounts of land. We will also read an article called Higher Productivity Used to Mean Higher Wages, but has that broken down now? And then we'll do an activity called Compensation that relates to that. So here is a summary of what we have learned in this module. And this concludes our look at Module 70, the markets for land and capital.